Go. Left. Are you just giving up? What's wrong?
Alright guys, so today we're going to be talking about Jedi Survivor, the sequel to 2019's Jedi Fallen Order. Now I know it's been a minute since I've posted, but I played this game, I had to sit on my thoughts a bit, and really wanted to take my time to put this video out. With that being said, if you want to hear my thoughts on the first game, I'm going to put a card to my review of that game on the screen now, but let's start by breaking down the game into each of its core components, starting with the bad performance and graphics and all of that fun stuff to talk about. This video is going to obviously contain spoilers for both gameplay and story elements, as I feel it's been long enough that if you wanted to play this or care about spoilers, you would have seen or played them by now. So let's go ahead and get into it. Jedi Survivor, unfortunately, even after delays, falls victim of the same problem many other games do nowadays, and that's a rushed release. While the game can look good at times, and a patch, and multiple at this point, have drastically improved the game, it was put out way too quickly, and the updates were just a little too late in my opinion. I had finished the game by the time all of these patches had came out. The game constantly suffers from texture pop-in, but more annoyingly, at least to me, a loss in frames. This is the most noticeable on Koba, the biggest planet in the game. It kind of serves as your open world home base, and the frame rate can drop into the teens, and it's noticeable significantly. It happens a bit everywhere aside from in cutscenes obviously, but this is the biggest instance of the frame rate drops. And on YouTube in a video that's been downloaded from me playing the game from Xbox to my PC and then through an editing software and then back to YouTube, you're not going to notice it as much as just playing the game, but I can tell you when this game launched it was significant. Other visual bugs consist of things like a weird hazy field surrounding Cal, as well as almost an echo effect that drags behind characters and cutscenes. I kind of thought that this was at first just something that happened as a flashback indicator. You know, sometimes movies or games do stuff in black and white to indicate that this is a flashback. I thought that was what was happening, as that's when I first noticed it was in a flashback, but that wasn't the case. It happened almost all of the time, and I eventually got over it, but it was obnoxious and annoying. But if you don't care too much about these types of problems, then this is a totally different game for you. This is my biggest problem with the game, and I'll tell you up front, this takes 2 points off the final score of the game. I'm not going to spoil what that score is, but this takes 2 points off of that final score just because of how significantly it impacts the gameplay, and especially somebody like me that nitpicks this type of shit. I like to go up to trees and look at the bark on the tree and say, look how good that tree looks. I'm a loser. I like that type of stuff. Now, that aside, when you're in an interior, or pretty much not on Koba, or in a cutscene, or after all of these patches, the game works. It works well, it looks good, it's not perfect, especially on PC it's still not perfect, but when it's working, it works well and looks like it should as a next-gen game. You got your ray tracing and all of that good stuff, HDR looks fantastic, it's a good time. Okay, like I said, when game works, game look good. Surprisingly though, all of my problems, aside from 6 crashes, were visual. I had no game-breaking bugs where my objective was unreachable, or I got some type of enemy spawn delay where the enemies weren't spawning in and I couldn't progress, or I had some unreachable platform or the world wasn't loading in. Nothing like that. It was always something visual, which again is annoying, but it's at least nothing that I had to completely restart my game and broke the game for me. So we can at least say that. Now, preferably the game would just fucking work after it gets delayed, but that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother video. Let's move on and talk about the stuff people actually care about, the gameplay. Practically every element from the first game is carried over mechanically and improved upon here, from the force abilities and their upgrades, the lightsaber stances, as well as the customization. So let's start out with what you're actually going to be doing in the moment-to-moment gameplay. While moving from one story mission to another, there are activities to do throughout the world that mainly consist of exploring for customization and skill upgrades. These are typically locked behind some kind of puzzle, combat encounter, parkour trial, and you have to progress into the story to unlock each of these areas within the open world to unlock set abilities and customization. There is a lot to explore here, and while it mainly all occurs on one planet, each planet has things to discover just like the first game. Now, is every chest worth getting? Absolutely not. We'll go into customization later and talk about why and all of that stuff. But let's talk about some of the other things you're going to be doing. There are side missions, which will lead you around the world and collect more bits of customization and skill points like I said earlier, but none of them are particularly notable or memorable at all. It just serves as a way to get you around the world and customize things. There's some bounties to do, which are pretty much the same thing as side missions. Run to a location, beat these enemies or puzzle, and then come back and get your reward, which for the most part are the most interesting things to do in the game, aside from just finding little caves or mini boss fights around the world. But the side missions are nothing special here, and I'm definitely not going to, or even now, remember any specific side mission. These are just to upgrade your character. Now, speaking of that, do you have to do this in order to play on the higher difficulties? Now, the first time through, this is a question. After that, you have New Game Plus, this doesn't matter at all. Personally, I played on the second to highest difficulty, Jedi Master, I think, the one below Grandmaster, and I never felt that the abilities or the absurd amount of stims I had, I think I ended the game with like 10 or 11, were needed in order to do story content. That being said, for boss fights, both in the story, but more particularly just around the world, the ones that are optional, you definitely need them, right? I mean, you think you don't need 10 stims, and for every single story mission, you sure as hell don't. You never use more than 3 or 4. But for fighting spoilers, Rancor, or both the Rancors, or fucking Ogdo Bogdo, you need all 10 of them, and more. You need every single skill you have, you need every stance, all of it. And so that's where this exploration stuff comes in. If you don't want to dabble in all of that, and you just want to play the story, you can definitely do that. They give you some free stims, and obviously by doing the story you get skill points. You just won't get every single ability. Now let's talk about the final thing you can do in this game aside from the main story. So, some of you are going to hate this, and some of you are going to love this. So there's a holo table game. It kind of works similar to how other games have card games or mini games within them. Assassin's Creed Valhalla has that little like dominoes type thing. The Witcher has Gwent. This has this holo table game. And so the way it works is it takes your scan mechanic from the first game, you carry it over into the second game. Whenever you scan a new enemy type, Stormtrooper, Flame Trooper, ATST, Purge Trooper, any droid, anything, you get them available in this game. You have a certain number of points, so let's say 10 points, and you can spend those points on different unit types to fight the enemies. Let's say a Super Battle Droid is 6 and a Stormtrooper is 2, you have 10 points. You put 1 Super Battle Droid and 2 Stormtroopers down, right? And obviously, it's more complex than that because you have melee units and ranged units, and you have to figure out, okay, well, do I want 34 chickens or do I want 1 big guy? Well, it depends on what type of enemy you're fighting. If they're using a bunch of ranged guys, you might want some shield guys, and it works differently in their strategy to it, and it's fun. The problem is, it's RNG, and this is where it pisses me off. So, if it just worked how you think it would work, the chickens, for example, that's what I call those little blue things, by the way, I call them chickens. If the chickens would just run at an enemy, if you put 4 chickens down, it consistently attacked the same enemy, doing the same move every single time, and there could be a little bit of strategy to it, that would be great, right? It's the same thing with, you know, some of the units with grenades or some of the units with rocket launchers. If you knew, okay, in increments of 7 seconds, it's going to throw a grenade or shoot a rocket, right? That way you could at least have some form of strategy to it. It doesn't work like that. Sometimes they shoot 10 rockets, sometimes they don't shoot any. Sometimes the chickens hit every single time, sometimes the chickens miss every single time. So while in wave 1 of this card game, this hollow table game, whatever you want to call it, let's say you used 3 stormtroopers and a purge trooper and you won the first time, then you do it again, you use that same lineup in the same positioning, you could lose just because they chose to shoot at guy number 2 first instead of shooting at guy number 1. So that's my problem with this game. When you lose higher waves, let's say you make it to wave 3 on a certain opponent, even if you lose, you have to restart all the way from the beginning and restart it over again. That's why that repetition thing is really annoying. Now, what do you get from doing this aside from the fun of doing it? Well, you can get some paints for BD or lightsabers, as well as some clothing options, haircuts, you know, some customization like everything else in the game. This isn't going to make the gameplay better in any way, shape, or form, it's just something to do within the game. Now, I actually, in my 6-page script, forgot the most important aspect of the game, the final aspect of the gameplay, the things that you can do, is gardening, right? And so, early on when you get to Koba, you have a garden on the rooftop of the saloon, the canteen, whatever you want to call it. I obviously don't have gameplay footage of this, and I'll tell you why in a second, because it's absolutely useless. I thought that you go around collecting all these plants and getting these seeds and planting them on the roof, and you don't unlock the actual, I'm going to call it, vendor to tell you about these plants for decent ways into the game, so I'm running around collecting them constantly, you know, getting every single one that I see. And then you get this vendor, and they just tell you about the plants. That's it. You don't get any sort of customization, like in this hollow table game, you don't get a reward, you don't get skill points, you don't get some cool bounty missions, you just get to know about plants. I don't care, so I stopped doing that immediately. So let me go on and move back to the actual important gameplay and talk about the different stances that are available within the game. At any time, you're able to equip 2 of the 5 stances in the game at once, having to meditate or essentially go to a save point to switch them out. You start the game with the single and double-sided blade, as well as the other force abilities that you ended the first game with. This is nice because it doesn't feel like you're backtracking and having to relearn things that a lot of games do that just gets really annoying. You have both the abilities from the first game. Now, all the individual skills that you had from the first game within the skill tree you have to unlock, as well as some new ones, but the stances themselves you start out this game with. Now, I ended up using these for a majority of the game, so pretty much all of the gameplay you're going to see the single and double-sided lightsaber. While I tried the other ones just on my first playthrough, and especially on this difficulty, and wanting to beat the game in a relatively reasonable amount of time, I didn't really want to mess with the other stances. On other difficulties or additional playthroughs, New Game Plus, then I could see you trying out the other stances. But let me at least talk about how they work and things I like and don't like about them. So relatively quickly, within the first 1 to 2 hours, I would say, you get the ability to dual wield lightsabers. And while this is easily the flashiest stance in the game, it's one of the hardest, right? The animations are significantly longer. There's a lot less time to read each input and get a lot of good parries off. The abilities, in my opinion, at least the starting ones, are worse than all of the other stances. And while it's really cool and I like it a lot, early on when you get it, on the difficulty I was on, with the low amount of stims and abilities I had, it just wasn't great. It wasn't something that I felt you could use viably on the difficulty I was on. I'm not saying it's bad, it's just at the place in the game you get this ability with the limited amount of upgrades you have at this point on the higher difficulties, they're just not viable yet. Again, you can use them later on. But let's move on to the blaster stance. So I hate this stance. I get its utility in like groups of enemies and with ranged enemies when you're fighting a bunch of melee guys, you need to take them out, or really hard boss fights. I understand that, right? But it just doesn't feel like Cal. It feels out of place for the character, and I just found myself not using it. Now, again, if you like it, if that's your thing, if you want to do like a playthrough where you use the blaster, nothing wrong with that. Some of the abilities are pretty cool. It's definitely a viable option. It's not too difficult to use, but I just feel that it felt wrong and it felt weird, and I'm playing a Star Wars game to use a lightsaber. I don't want to use a blaster particularly, and I just wasn't my cup of tea, right? But let's move on to the crossguard. Now, I thought this was going to be my favorite stance. This is the one I was most excited for. I like how it looks. I typically like slower, more damaging types of weapons instead of the fast, quick, low damage weapons. That's typically my thing. But in this game, again, on the difficulty I was on, and even with the abilities for the crossguard, I just felt that you didn't stand a chance. It's so slow, and it's just cumbersome. Again, anything other than one-on-one boss fights or really one-on-one fights, which it makes no sense to use because of how slow it is, and anything other than a boss fight, it just didn't feel viable. Now, that's my opinion. Again, just like all of the other stances, you can go through and use this on a playthrough. You can definitely do good with this, but I just felt it wasn't the best stance. Each stance is viable on really any difficulty, and especially with upgrades, but I just felt that the original two were the best for the way I play, and I enjoyed the most. I'm not bashing your playstyle here. I don't want any hate for saying that, oh, you used the first two, that's boring. That's just what I'm into. You can do whatever you choose. I ain't hating on any of them. From here, we have the force abilities. You start the game with pull and push, as well as freeze, although this is now bound to like an ultimate on your sticks instead of a normal ability like the first game. Something I personally like less. You could do a lot more with it as an ability on your bumpers or triggers, depending on what system you're playing on. For example, you could freeze individual enemies, blaster bolts, pick people up and throw them into the blaster bolts that were frozen midair. There was just a lot of cool stuff you could do with it in the first game, and I found myself not really using it that much here, so it felt like you kind of lost an ability there. Now, I haven't really seen anybody else have this complaint. It's just something that I personally wasn't a big fan of. I would have much rather it stayed where it was. And the ability that it actually is replaced by is Mind Trick, which is something in not just this game, but every game I hate as an ability, having enemies become your allies. I just never ever use that. I just really hate it and find it boring, and it very rarely works well. So that's just something that I have to nitpick if I have to choose something to talk bad about in the gameplay. But let me talk more about the abilities. You get dash, which was again in the first game, but it's used a lot more here. It's introduced late in the first game and just used really for one sequence and to go back and backtrack through areas, and with the amount of exploration in this game, it basically unlocks a whole new level of areas that you can get to. Now finally, you get Slam and Lift, and I feel like you get these abilities not only really late in the game, but they just don't do much with them. I mean, they have, your typical upgrades, pick up more enemies, slam more enemies, do more damage, all of that type of stuff, be able to pick up and slam bigger enemies, but I feel like they could have just done a little bit more with them, made them more unique, or given them to you early on and then introduced a more interesting final ability. I don't know, just as a final ability other than the ultimate you get later, it just didn't really feel like a big special ability. I used it in groups, but for the most part, push and pull are the main abilities that I used here. Now again, while there's nothing too interesting or crazy in terms of abilities, they don't do anything absolutely insane like give you lightning or anything. They work well in combination with the stances and abilities. It's hard when you have essentially 5 different types of combat and combining those with the force abilities and making them all work and intertwine and all of that stuff. So I understand why they didn't go crazy with the force abilities, but I would have liked maybe at least one interesting new one, but that's just my opinion. You could absolutely love the Slam. Finally, let's discuss the boss fights. So these can be separated into main story fights and what I'm going to call side boss fights. I kind of discussed this earlier with like Ogdo Bogdo and all of that stuff, but I feel that the main fights were never too difficult, and my problem with this is the same problem I have with every game that has this level of exploration, is that whenever you just become insanely overpowered and do everything like me, this game doesn't really let you go absolutely insane, but you can go into, let's say, the halfway point of the game with 11 stims. You can go in with almost the whole skill tree done into like the 4th to last boss fight. And for the most part, and I mean, we're 20 minutes in, I can talk spoilers now. Other than the Darth Vader fight, they're all pretty easy, right? The Darth Vader fight, I had to actually try on Jedi, whatever I said I was playing on Master. But aside from that, especially the Bode fights, which is disappointing because I like that twist a lot, but we'll get into that later, they were just real easy. But the side fights, the exact opposite. So there's a balance here that needs to be had. They need to bring the main story fights up a tiny bit in difficulty, because you can't go too far to where people that don't do any exploration or side content just have absolutely no shot. But then the side fights can't be so absolutely insane that you have to do all of the side content, because then that just doesn't balance out. You see what I'm saying? There has to be some sort of balance to it. There's, I think, 7 main boss fights in the story, even though you technically fight Dagonberry like 3 times, and he does have the best fight. When you fight him the final time, other than Darth Vader, and just because that is Darth Vader, that is the best fight. I think both the Darth Vader fight and the first Bode fight are only as good as they are because of the twist with Bode and because you're fighting Darth Vader. Right? Mechanically, the best fight is, in my opinion, probably the last Dagonverra fight, or the mini fight that you do to get the crossguard stance, right? But again, that just depends on what type of boss battle you like. If you like a lot of dodging and a lot of unblockable abilities and all that type of stuff, you might like the Bode fight or the Darth Vader fight more. I like a lot of just quick parry, just constant moving and fighting within my boss fights. So it really just depends on what you like. I could sit here and talk for 45 minutes about every single aspect of the gameplay and every single fight within the game, but let me talk about the customization before I move on to story and finally wrapping this up. So the customization is kind of broken down into your clothes and hair, and then BD and your lightsaber. With clothes, you have your jacket, your shirt, and pants. There's sets within each of these that all match. You don't have to match them. You can choose your Jedi jacket with your Exile shirt and then your bomber pants. And then each of them have a color scheme that you can go through and choose and mix and match however you want. Now, depending on how much side content you like to do is going to depend, obviously, on how much of this you get. Let's say you like the Survivor jacket. Well, you don't get the Survivor jacket, shirt, and pants all at the same time. You get them each individually, and then you have to get the colors. Not individually, but you get the colors as a set. So theoretically, to get a full set, you have to open 4 different chests or loot spots in order to get the full set. So even exploring what I feel is a lot, I'm still missing stuff at the end of the game. And for the most part, I liked a lot of the outfits, right? Most games, I usually stick to the trailer outfit or like an outfit from a previous game, or maybe I'll find one new one that I liked. I would say there were 3 or 4 here that I really liked and could switch between at any time. So it felt really nice to have customization that wasn't just completely 1 or 2-sided, and you could choose and mix and match in a really interesting way, and depending on where the story was or how you wanted to look for a certain section, and you could always just do it on the fly. You didn't have to like return to a bench to change your clothes. Same thing goes for the hair, right? You can have the hair from the first game, you can have a mullet, you can have all these different types of hairstyles, right? They even got a poncho in the game. Same thing with the mustache. You can do mustache, just beard, just mustache, no mustache, or beard. You can mix and match it. You can have freaking handlebars if you want. Do whatever you want to do. But more interestingly, in my opinion, let's talk about the lightsaber. So now that we're talking about quite literally the best part of the game, you have the lightsaber, which is broken down into primary, secondary, accent, grip, and condition. The condition is just, do you want it to look new, or do you want it to look like you just dug it up out of the sand on Tatooine, right? So there's really not much to that. I just put it on new at the very beginning of the game and kept it there the entire time. But secondary, accent, grip, and primary is, just the parts of the lightsaber, and there's so much more than the first game. They have so many different paints and styles and pieces, right? Because you have 18 different options You have the grip and the emitter and the vents and all of this stuff, and then depending on what stance you're using, the lightsaber changes. Then you have to put an emitter on both sides if you're using the double-sided one, and you can have one emitter type on one side and a different emitter type on the other side. You can change the color of the freaking lightsaber, and then every single one of those 18 parts can have a different primary, secondary, grip, and accent color. Not only the color, but the material, right? You can have leather, or wood, or Beskar, or just chrome, or bronze, or gold, and blah, and blah, and blah, and blah, and a million different options. I probably spent, of my 32 hours it took me to beat this game, at least 3 just doing this. I mean, I have 4 more clips that are all 5 minutes long of me doing this, just messing around with the lightsaber. It's fantastic. I would literally play this game, just making lightsaber simulator. It's so much fun. Then, I didn't even talk about BD yet. So BD has his head and his visor and his legs and like his ear bit and his core, right? And he has not as many options, it's only 9, and these are, for some reason, a lot harder to find than the lightsaber parts. I don't know why, it's just RNG that I came across less of these, and they're not as great, right? They're not bad, there's not, none that I would use, but whereas the lightsaber parts of the 18, probably 10 of them I liked, of these 9, I liked 2 or 3 of them. But then when you go to the colors, you have the same thing with the materials. All the materials you have for the lightsaber, you got the same thing for BD, the Beskar, the chrome, the gold, all of that stuff. You can change his colors and all of that. It's all good time. The customization here in this game is really good. One of the best parts of the game. But now that I've ranted about that, 25 minutes into the video, let's talk about the story. Jedi Survivor starts many years after the first game, with our characters separated throughout the galaxy. While we later learn that each character is kind of on their own path, Cal is continuing his fight against the Empire. Feeling lost and like his fight against the Empire has just been for nothing as they have so much reach across the galaxy, Cal ends up crash landing after some mission on Koba, a planet that Grease is currently calling home. The 2 characters first reunite, and he's the first character you meet from the first game. From there, we meet a droid from the Old Republic, in which we learn about the fabled planet Tanalorr. This was a hidden planet thought to be myth in which the Jedi could train. This then becomes Cal's primary focus, as he wants to use it as kind of like a safe house to hide from the Empire. Now, this is where I get a little bit nitpicky with the plot. It just so happens to be the plot of Episode 9, kind of a wee bit, right? There's a hidden planet in which you need a MacGuffin to reach, and has some treacherous path that they end up having to navigate without said MacGuffin. That's the same thing that happens in Episode 9, it's the same thing that happens here. Do I care that much? No, not really, because the rest of the story holds up, and this is just a small aspect of it, but I just wanted to point that out. Regardless, from here, this is where you get the shot in the trailer where Cal frees Dagan Vera from his stasis. Dagan was a old Jedi from the High Republic, as they call it in this game, previously trying to use Tanalorr as a training ground for the Jedi. For the Council ended up denying his request, in which he turned to the dark side and started murdering people like the Jedi tend to do, in which they put him in stasis, and that's where you get this hundreds of years gap, and it picks up when Cal ends up freeing him. So this is where you get your main villain. You now have Cal wanting to find the keys and the compasses to get to Tanalorr in order to use it as a safe haven, like I mentioned, and Dagan Vera also wanting to continue his previous quest of finding the planet, and so they're both competing to get the compasses and who can get them first and who can get there first and who can claim the planet. The majority of the rest of the game is spent in the hunt for these compasses used to traverse the dangerous path to reach Tanalorr. This brings you eventually to Jedha. This is where you meet Merrin and Cere, again characters from the previous game. Like I mentioned earlier, each of them are kind of on their own journey. Merrin exploring the galaxy after leaving Dathomir, and Cere taking a role in leading the Hidden Path. This is carried over from the Obi-Wan show, which is something that doesn't play too heavily into it, but it was something that had a little bit of world building to it, and it felt nice. It felt like stuff was just a little bit connected. It doesn't really go beyond that, just a name that's connected to another show, but it's at least something that carried over from a previous kind of thing in Star Wars. Now, the whole fan fiction about Cal and Marin gets carried on here and surprisingly somehow does not feel forced. I didn't feel it at all in the first game, but I saw all this stuff online about, oh, Cal and Marin, oh, so hot, the Goth Dathomir girl, you know, all that stuff. And they did it here. I mean, it wasn't anything crazy. They didn't like fully, you know, go into depth with it, but they introduced it more, and it wasn't absolutely obnoxious like I thought it was going to be, so that was at least a nice development. You have Cere here, who does what she needs to do. She definitely gets a lot more to do in the first game, but we'll talk about that a bit more later. This is where you also meet Cordova, which was a hologram in the first game. It's where you got BD1, and he was kind of the Jedi guiding you along to find the hidden holocron in the first game. Well, you get to meet him in person here, working with Cere, and again, we'll talk about him more later too. But once the group is all reunited and you meet all of the characters from the first game, you continue your search for the compasses, as now you change your mind on wanting a place to hide, and you want to use Tanalorr as a training ground for both Jedi and the Resistance to fight the Empire. This eventually leads to multiple confrontations between Cal and Dagan Vera, as well as his second-hand man, Gravis. You eventually end up defeating both of them surprisingly early in the game, about halfway through the game, with absolutely no villain left. And so we're sitting here at about this halfway point, and I was actually saying while playing this, the story was kind of underwhelming at this point. Yes, there was a villain, but it really wasn't anything too incredibly interesting. It was pretty boring, and I get that because there's so much stuff in Star Wars, you can't do anything too previous before this or too crazy after this, because there's content both before and after, but it felt like nothing was really happening. It was a relatively small scale story. And it stays like that, even as we progress further and we talk about it more. It never gets to this large scale that at least I felt the first game had. But the storytelling within it and how the characters interact does get more interesting. So let me go ahead and break into the second half of the game, what I consider the significantly better half. So major spoilers, if you haven't already got spoilers fucking 33 minutes into the video, this is where we get to talk about Bode. So Bode has been almost like a sidekick throughout the main story, but much less so than the other characters like Cere and Marin and Grease, but he feels just like a normal ass dude. And while I thought from the beginning he was just going to be used as a friend that wasn't one of those main characters, but was somebody that you at least connected with because you constantly were exploring with them and doing story missions with them, that they were going to use to kill off in the end, I didn't expect what they actually do. So let's talk about that. Bode constantly references his daughter, that he has a daughter, that he's doing all of this for his daughter. That being said, after Dagan Vera is defeated and Cal has now all of the compasses and access to get to Tanalorr, a switch flips within Bode. He wants to use the planet to hide and stay safe away from the Empire and just keep his daughter safe instead of using it as a training ground and being able to fight back against the Empire. He's doing what he thinks is best to protect his kid. So after defeating Dagan Gera, you all return to Jeddah to take the compasses, get everybody, and go to Tanalorr. This is where Bode turns. Now, he is an informant for the Empire. He always has been. He was put in your group as kind of a spy, and so he ends up killing Cordova, taking the compass, and running off. He calls in the Empire to attack Cere's hidden path base, and so now you have Cere and Marin and all of them fighting off against the Empire while Cal is pursuing Bode. Eventually, as Cal, you catch Bode wanting revenge for him killing Cordova and stealing the compass. You engage in mortal combat, only to learn that Bode is in fact the Jedi Survivor. Now that's the name of the game, alright? That is some A-tier writing, if you ask me. Now I saw that Bode was gonna, twist and become the villain and try to kill you and get the compass, because he kind of hints to it after you kill Dagan in those 10 minutes of cutscene traveling between the planets. You kind of see it coming. But the Jedi thing? Absolutely not. Never saw that coming. So I was really happy for that twist. And then, as you see playing here in the background, you get to play as Cere while Cal is chasing after Bode. Cal ends up losing to Bode and Bode escapes, and then Darth Vader shows up, ends up killing everybody. Cere dies to Vader, in an interesting fight. I think Cere got a bit too many hits in on Vader. I get they have to give her like a worthy death. I understand that. But it's Darth Vader we're talking about, and this is like prime Darth Vader. So I think he should have absolutely decapitated her, like flawless victory. But that's just me absolutely liking Anakin Skywalker as my favorite character. So I'm a bit biased. But this leaves Cal now being betrayed by Bode, and now having lost Cere, pretty much the entire hidden path, all of the archives, all of its data, all of that, and Cordova, all in the same day. So Cal's kind of at a low point here, right? And this is when he goes hunting for Bode, and this is where you see all the spoilery-ish stuff that you'd be seeing, probably all of the TikToks of him using the dark side. So after he absolutely pops off, just slicing through this base, you confront Bode, and you basically get the spiel that I just gave you about how he was an informant for the Empire, placed on Cal's team. He was basically bad the whole time, just helping them hunt down Cal. Cal gets big angry, Bode gets away, and this starts kind of the final act of the game. You decide that you're going to try to make it to Tanalorr with no compass and kind of just point and use the Force to jump through space and get there and pursue after Bode. The rest of the game plays out pretty much exactly how you expect. You confront him, try to persuade him, hey, you know, you got a kid, like, we don't want to engage in Mortal Kombat, blah, 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 and then you engage in Mortal Kombat. So, you end up defeating Bode, and this is pretty much it. It's assumed that after you burn the bodies, that Cal is going to go ahead and start training Jedi on this planet and kind of start up the resistance that we see in the beginning of episode 4. Now, I can only assume, due to the fact that Cal Kestis is nowhere to be found anywhere, that he will be killed by Vader in the third game, which I have absolutely no problem with. I like it when the main character dies when we're done. Now, don't kill him off and then make a fourth game, but kill him off if we're done, do 3 games. I'm probably going to give it a 10 out of 10 if we do that. I'll be happy. Let him die fighting Vader, have all of the Jedi train, let them all die and be destroyed by the Empire. End the game real sad and depressing, and that'll be a fantastic third game. I highly doubt they're going to do that, but I would enjoy that. Overall, I felt that the story of Jedi Survivor was relatively weak until about halfway through, and then it just really picked up and amped up from there. The highs in this game are better than the highs from the original, but the second game takes its time getting to those highs, whereas the first game I felt was more consistent all the way through. But that's it for the story section. Now I'm going to move on. Let's go ahead and wrap things up. This video is getting very long, and let's give this game a final rating, a final score, so we can compare and contrast it to the first game. Now, while it sounds like I've said a lot of bad things regarding this game, which tends to be the case with games that I like a lot, I still absolutely love it. I'm only being tough on the game because it is so good and because the first one was so good. That being said, it still has its problems, both in the actual design of the game, but more importantly, in my opinion, the performance. Your own personal score for this game is going to heavily depend on your tolerance of the performance issues, as well as what time you pick the game up. There's been multiple patches, like I said at the beginning of this video at this point, and that being said, even when I finished this game and started making this video a week after the game, it still was practically unplayable on PC and rough on console. And up to a few days ago, I didn't know how heavily I wanted that to impact the overall score of the game. But if this was any other game, if it wasn't the sequel to Fallen Order, if it wasn't a Star Wars game, I would take heavy points off of performance because that really pisses me off. On one hand, the story lacks consistency and pacing, like I said before, but at other points is absolutely fantastically written and full of twists that I didn't see coming, and that's hard for me to say. I see a lot of twists coming in a lot of games and shows, and I understand that you're supposed to see things coming and a lot of stuff, but I'm talking like Bode turning was obvious, right? Bode, something happening with Bode was just obvious from the start of the game. It was very clear that's what they were going to do with him just because of the nature of the character. But him being a Jedi, him being the Jedi survivor, that no chance would I have ever guessed that. Not in a million years would I have figured that out. So stuff like that, Darth Vader showing up, absolutely love that kind of stuff. The same thing can be said for the gameplay. While most of the improvements are relatively simple, for the most part, everything feels like an advancement on the first game and works perfectly into perfecting the gameplay. The lightsaber combat here is probably the best there is, and probably the best there will be for a long time. There's not much more you can do to make this better, other than adding more force abilities, which, you know, with story elements you can only do so much, especially if you're trying to set up a third game. Both the story and gameplay elements, along with the fantastic customization, just comparatively to the first game, make this an almost perfect game. Unfortunately, the performance at launch absolutely sucked, and a lot of the enjoyment of this game was just taken out because of that performance. Again, depending on how much that bothers you and at what time you pick the game up is going to drastically influence your score. So, with all of that in mind, I would give the game a 7 out of 10. It could easily be an 8 or a 9 without those performance issues. You can pick this game up in another month, and it's easily an 8 or a 9, depending on how much you like the story. But the first game is a 9 in my mind. It didn't have a lot of these issues, and these, especially the first 2 days I played the game, the first 40% of the game, was just absolutely unbearable in any type of open world environment. So that's just my thoughts. I know this is a very long video. Let me know what you guys thought of this game, if you liked it more than the first one, less than the first one, what your favorite lightsaber color was, your customization, what stance you used, all of that good stuff down in the comments below. And I'll see you guys on the next one.